Oh, no, it's a long story. Yeah. Oh, yeah. For now. You know, eventually, no.
I suffer too.
Yeah. Okay. Shall we?
That's cool. Good morning. This is the first meeting of the Quic working group. I'm Lars Eggert. This is my co-chair, Mark Nottingham. If you're here because you're expecting fireworks and exciting discussions, you might as well get some more sleep. This will be a very, very boring meeting on purpose, so that next time we get fewer people.
Eventually, it'll just be us.
I'm not joking. I mean, just try and stay awake. This is the first meeting, and it is going to be boring, right? We're basically going to go over the charter. We're going to talk about what documents do we have that are individual that we might want to think about adopting. We've communicated how we're going to do work already on the list. We're going to go over that, i.e. use GitHub, have interims.
If you're on the ends of a row, you're probably going to need to move in because there's still a lot of people coming in the back. So, or get your knees out of the way.
Yeah. So this room has 300 seats. In Berlin, we were 400 people. So, your backpack is probably not going to keep its seat. No, not yours specifically, Jenna. Just.
It's okay. It's okay.
Anyway, and I think, just keep on coming in and keep looking for seats. We don't mind. There's a lot in the front.
Yeah,
and
there are in the front.
You can walk up here.
Yeah. Okay, shall we?
Go for it.
So this is something you should hopefully all be familiar with. It's the Note Well statement. If you're not familiar with it, it's the terms under which you participate here. And you can find out more by using your favorite internet search engine to search for IETF Note Well. But this is important stuff because this is about intellectual property and other such things. And we've already done the blue sheets. Magnus is our scribe. Thank you, Magnus. From all the former chairs in the room, lots of clapping. Agenda bashing. This is all we have. Lars went over it briefly. We're going to go over the charter, talk about how we plan on operating as a working group, and discuss that and make sure that everyone understands what we as chairs are thinking and agrees with that. Go over the drafts that are in our charter as potential starting points, and our intent is to move towards adopting at least a subset of those, if not the entire set. And finally, we have a few presentations which, time permitting, people wanted to talk about specific topics. Any agenda bashing on that? Ted needs a seat. Ted, there's one up here. Yes, agenda bashing. Oh, that was the I've got a seat hand. Okay.
Joe, there's a seat up front.
Joe, right next to Martin. Yeah.
All right.
Okay, let's go. So, first off, why don't we do like every other slide for this maybe to get through it? Does that make sense?
Oh,
God. So, we have a somewhat long charter. We thought it was important that everybody who attended this meeting at least had a bit of a review to make sure we understood it and had agreement about it. This is the time if you have questions about the charter lingering or misunderstandings lingering, this is the time to discuss it. I would much rather discuss it now than in 6 months or a year. We're here to provide a standards track specification for UDP-based stream multiplexing and encrypted transport protocol based on the drafts that you see down there. And we are taking based on to mean that those are our obvious starting points. We'll talk about the drafts in more detail in a little while and how we're going to go about adopting them. But those are our assumed starting points.
keep going.
Okay. Oh, well. Key goals: minimizing connection establishment and overall transport latency, starting with HTTP2. And so that is, of course, one of the deliverables that we were was mentioned in the charter. Providing multiplexing without head-of-line blocking, which is continuing what HTTP2 started down at the transport layer. Requiring only changes to path endpoints to enable deployment. Enabling multipath, and I think we went back and forth on this a little bit in the chartering process. And forward error correction extensions. So those are not necessarily things that'll ship by default, and providing always secure transport using TLS 1.3 by default. And then we go into the 5 focus areas. Any questions about this?
So a question on the Jabber list
Name?
about availability of slides. Are these slides posted?
Oh, did we post these?
They're yours.
No.
Question marks abound at the front of the room. Okay.
I will.
The answer is no.
Do I have them in email?
Yes, I emailed them.
Okay, I'll post them.
But this is literally the charter text. So, any questions about those? Okay. First focus area, core transport work, describing the wire format, mechanisms for connection establishment, stream multiplexing, data reliability, loss detection and recovery, congestion control, version negotiation, and options negotiations. Quite a mouthful. Congestion control will describe use of a standardized congestion controller as default scheme for Quic. Defining new schemes is explicitly out of scope. Okay. Second is security. We'll describe how we use TLS 1.3 for key negotiation and describe how those keys are used to provide confidentiality and integrity protection of both application data and Quic headers. It'll ensure that Quic has security and privacy properties that are at least as good as the stack composed of TLS 1.3 using TCP or MPTCP when using multipath. And this last clause, I think, is going to be an important yardstick that we use in discussions going forward. So it's important that people understand that. And note that it says at least as good, not just as good as. Any questions? Okay. Third is a mapping between specific application protocols and transport of Quic. The first being HTTP2 with the goal of minimizing web latency using Quic, accommodating the extension mechanisms that we talked about in HTTP2. And we can do additional protocols by updating the charter, which I know people have talked about things like DNS, but not yet.
If you have an empty seat next to you, could you raise your hand? There's a few people in the back.
There's one still up front here.
All right, guys, come up front and sit down.
Actually, yeah, there are quite a few up front, actually. The fourth focus area is multipath for connection migration between paths and load sharing across multiple paths. That's not one of the actual deliverables that we have, but it's enabling multipath, I think, is the focus here.
Yeah, the idea is to have, there were some extensions that were discussed as part of the chartering effort, and they're not part of the charter, but so if we're doing well with the protocol itself, those are the obvious next things we want to do. And so keeping them in mind as we do the architecture is a good idea. And that's why they mentioned.
And finally, the fifth focus area is providing an applicability and manageability statement, describing how and under what circumstances Quic may be safely used, and describing deployment and management implications of the protocol. So that is a separate document. We don't have an input document for that, and we need to solicit input for that and find an editor for it. So I think we need to go to the ops area and talk to folks there. If folks in this room are interested in that, please talk to us, the chairs, because we do need to deliver this and start work on this as well. And talking to a few folks, I think doing this in parallel with the work would be a useful thing to do, rather than leaving it to the end. Okay. Here's the fun part. Current practices for network management of transport protocols include the ability to apply access control lists, hashing of flows for equal cost multipath routing, directional signaling of flows, signal of flow setup and teardown, and the ability to export information about flows for accounting purposes. So that is a laundry list of current practices, and I would assume not a complete one. The Quic protocol need not be defined to enable each of these abilities or enable them in the same way as they're enabled by TCP when used with TLS 1.3, but the working group must consider the impact of the protocol on network management practices, reflecting the tensions described in RFC 7258, which is the pervasive monitoring RFC. Any questions or thoughts?
Eric Rasquala. So I don't know what this means. As in, John and I talked about it 5 minutes ago, so we've considered it. Are we done? I'm quite serious. Like what? Like the charter's a contract between the IESG and the working group.
Yes.
What does this require us to actually do?
There are ISG members in the room, I believe.
Spencer. So I had the same reaction, Eric.
Yeah.
So consider means we did it and we're done, right? But I don't think that's the intent.
Right.
I mean, Benoit should come and talk about this, but the reason I'm asking is because I don't want to have is to be 3 years into this effort and then be told we have to produce a new document with terms we haven't considered, and now we have pipeline stall. So if I'd like to know what for customers to fill in this, so I know we can start that effort now if we're going to do anything.
Spencer?
Spencer Dawkins, speaking as the responsible for area director. So the intention with this here is to consider it. The working group should do the right thing. And I'm watching that, and I will support the working group when it does the right thing.
So what I'm hearing is that you and John are having a discussion is not sufficient because we need to be seen to have the discussion and reach some consensus.
So channeling the job room, Ted Hardy posts that for consider, he believes that document was intended. Ted, oh, you're in the room.
Ted's in the room.
Oh, okay. Well, then who were you talking to? That's a good point.
Jari Arko on the ISG, and I just want to say that at least for me, and I can't necessarily speak for the other ADs, but for me this means that the working group needs to discuss this topic, and whoever is in the working group, you'll need to figure out what what issues you need to consider there, but it was not intended as the ISG later would somehow impose something special for you as you try to get the document approved. So this is for the working group's efforts, not for us to give you a hard time later. Thank you.
I think Miria was first and then Jabbar.
Mia Kulevan. So I think one part of the discussion was actually the applicability management statement. And as you said previously, we should start this early on so it's in parallel and not like afterwards. The other part of why we have it in the charter is actually to allow this discussion and not forbid it and not say like this doesn't belong here. We want to have this discussion here. But like the way this is written means that it doesn't have to impact protocol design because there's always a trade-off. You might make a decision that is, I don't know, supporting manageability in a certain way, or you might make a decision that optimizes the protocol, and so there's a trade-off, and we don't want to impose that you have to do the same things TCP are doing. You have to have a discussion about it.
So would it be fair to say that the operations and manageability document should document the discussion we were having, for example, on how you would do exporting information for accounting with Quic as designed in the group? Spencer's waving. Do you want to say something, or you're saying hi?
Since I will be the first area director to see that document, Spencer Dawkins speaking as the first area director to see that document, that's something that I would be happy to send to the ISG for ISG evaluation. So I'm not telling you that's the right answer, the only right answer. I'm telling you that that's at least the right answer as far as I'm concerned.
Okay. Aaron.
The comment on Jabber says, this slide is a non sequitur. None of the current practices that Quic is going to ignore deal with the tensions described in 7258.
Who was that from?
It's an alias that I prefer not to repeat at the microphone.
I see.
Benoit, Claes, so Lars, I would agree with your assessment. If you go back one slide. So the thing is, if we've got operators, we have to tell them, okay, what's going to happen with your protocol whenever you want to enable it? This is the main point. Then, it was a bit short. So the next section is, okay, typically we've been doing blah with a long list of things. Tell us what you want,
give us the advice for operators, and that's it, right? There is no constraint in the end telling you're not doing flow management, okay, you're out. It's not the point.
Hi, Brian Trammell. I'd point out that we should probably go back down this rabbit hole in the if time permits bit when I talk about like one of the first discussions that we're going to have here, which is the state management stuff. I also want to go ahead and raise my hand and say I am willing to work on the manageability document as a with a pen or as an editor or something. So if we can get together a group around that, I don't want to be the sole author of it, obviously, but
Great, thanks.
And you don't need to be on the ISG or IAB to come to the microphone. Just so.
I think we have a better understanding, if not complete agreement about this slide, but I think it's clear that we will be discussing these topics. Yes. Extensions that will support partial reliability and negotiation and use of forward error correction schemes are out of scope in this version of the working group charter. Note that consensus is required both for changes to the current protocol mechanisms and retention of current mechanisms. In particular, because something is in the initial document set does not imply that there's consensus around the feature, around how it's specified. And I think that's an important point. We're going to talk today about adopting a set of documents. It's important that people realize by doing so, all we're saying is this is a starting point. These are a set of bits that we're going to adopt as a way to get moving, and everything in those documents is up for discussion. It is not assumed that if we adopt them, nothing can be changed. And so please keep that in mind when we're discussing adoption, because I think that by adopting documents, it's one of the best ways we can just get moving. The Quic working group will work closely with the HTTP working group. Who are those people? Especially on the Quic mapping for HTTP2. Hopefully that's an obvious relationship. Any questions? Okay. Finally, and we're almost done. In order to achieve the milestones set out below, the group expects to make extensive use of interim meetings, especially in its first year, which is effectively 2017. As hopefully you've all seen, we've already scheduled one interim meeting in January. And in discussions, we're not going to put a solid calendar out yet, but in discussions, it looks like what we're thinking about at this point is holding roughly one interim between each major IETF meeting. So that would imply one in January next year, one around the June timeframe, and one somewhere around September or October. And in addition, we're talking about holding, requesting what might be considered a large number of meetings during the IETF meeting. So 2 or 3 2.5-hour meetings, and experimenting with how we set those up to make them as productive as possible. And this kind of bleeds into the next slide, which I'll go ahead to. This is the milestones. We're chartered to submit our documents in March of 2018, and the last one, the HTTP mapping, in November of 2018. So that's a very aggressive time frame. It may be too aggressive. We may slip on that. But I think it's important to realize we do not have an unlimited amount of time to work on this, because we're asking a large number of people to spend a large amount of their time on this effort, and they can't make an unbounded commitment to that. And so this is why we're chartered to have a large number of interims, so that we can make progress in a reasonable amount of time and not require people to have a 5-year commitment to this effort, because that would not work. Any questions, comments? Okay.
I don't know if you have anything on remote attendance. We are trying to provide a remote attendance possibility at the interims. I guess the minimum that we would like to see is a quality that's sort of equivalent to what you get at the IETF as a remote attendee. So MeetEcho is one option that we might do. If we can do something better, we might try it. So we're open for suggestions, you know, of what could be tried here. But yeah, we haven't announced specifically what we're going to do for the first one, because we don't quite know yet what the options are. But there should be an email with more logistical details soon.
I think it's safe to say you should expect us to be experimenting with this pretty continuously to try and find the right mix. And that could involve a number of things. So let's talk a little bit about how we think the working group is going to do its work. Today, we're going to talk about adopting a set of documents. We want to get a sense of what people in this room think, and then we'll take that to the list and confirm it. Once we do that, we'll appoint a number of editors. I think once we have the discussion in this room, we have some folks in mind, and we'll talk about that. Then we want to start gathering issues. I know people have already started to talk about issues on the list, and that's great. And then we want to start, the implementation and feedback cycle. We want to focus very strongly on getting a diversity of implementers working on this protocol and getting their feedback into the process, so we can have that virtuous cycle going. And so a lot of what we do, especially around things like the interims, is going to be designed to try and encourage that. And in parallel with that, we need to engage a number of different communities, and this is a partial list. We especially need to engage, as was discussed before, the operator community, so they understand what's coming and we understand what they need. The transport and application communities, of course, which hopefully we already have a good representation of. And of course the implementers, because if nobody implements it, it's not really worth doing this. As discussed on the list, we plan on using GitHub for the majority of the work in terms of tracking the drafts and tracking what issues are important. We have a process that we've described and used in the HTTP working group that seems to be working well for doing that. No, that didn't work. Why doesn't the link work? Let's see. No, it really doesn't work. Okay. This crazy web thing, it's never going to work out. Let's see. Oh, well, I need... Sorry? Wrong browser? So this is what we've proposed. Starting off, this kind of sets up the major points. In addition to participating in IETF meetings, and we've talked about the interims briefly, you can participate in the mailing list as always. And we also allow people to discuss specific issues on the GitHub issues list itself. The idea there being that we really want to encourage implementers and developers who aren't able to track the full fire hose of the mailing list to come in and raise an issue or discuss something that's interesting to them and reflect that into the work. And the way we do this is that while you can discuss things on the issues list, consensus always needs to be confirmed on the mailing list, on the IETF mailing list, so that it's possible for folks to only participate on the mailing list if they wish to, and still have a say on all the important issues of the working group. And so I won't go through all the details here. Hopefully people have had a read of this beforehand, because we put on the mailing list a while back. But it describes how you can raise issues, how we, the chairs, will resolve issues, and who gets notified of that, and what process that goes through, and how we deal with GitHub specific things like pull requests and so forth, as well as having the note well. Importantly, one thing to mention here is that if you really don't want to use GitHub, we will have a separate mailing list, which all of the comment traffic on the issues list will be mirrored to. So every time someone makes a comment on an issue on GitHub, a mail will be sent with that comment to this mailing list. So if you really don't want to use GitHub at all, you can subscribe to that IETF mailing list, and you'll still see that comment traffic. We've done that in the HTTP working group as well. I'm not sure how many people subscribe to it, but it's, I think, an important thing to have that. For those who are concerned, we can talk about we're taking steps to assure that all this data is mirrored and archived properly, so that we don't have any assets that could be lost. But I think that's more an administrative thing at this point. Any thoughts, concerns? I see Jeff.
Hi, Mark. Jeff Hodges. So is this issue announce list separate from the main Quic working group mailing list?
Yes, it is. We don't want to have a fire hose pointed at the main working group list. It'll be that on its own.
And it's not been created yet, I think.
No, it's not been created.
And how are you doing the gatewaying? Are you using the W3C server?
What W3 server?
Okay. So, actually, we need to bump this up to IETF-wide discussion. And I noticed that there's been a long thread on the.
There are many IETF-wide discussions on this right now. Yes.
So the W3C has a server deployed, which is open source, that does all this kind of gatewaying to.
I'm aware of it.
Group
yes.
mailing lists. So we ought to be doing.
But
anyway,
I think
sure. Time out. This is fine. I don't object. I'm glad that you have this separate list. would encourage everybody to subscribe to both. And we'll go from there.
Okay.
Yeah, this is part of a wider discussion that's going on how the IETF in general is going to use GitHub and similar services, right? And HTTP was maybe the front runner. We are following closely behind what they did, but if the IETF has consensus to do things one way for everybody, we will probably follow along.
We'll be tracking that discussion closely and giving input to it, no doubt. Yeah. Okay. Let's see if we can find the presentation again. Yeah, okay. So if you haven't had a chance to look at that, please do, because that will effectively be our working procedure. And it's important everybody understands how we're going about that and where different things live. Meeting planning, we discussed the January interim. If you haven't yet, please, and you intend to come, please do register for it as soon as possible. We put a 2-week deadline on that, but it would be incredibly helpful if people registered earlier than that, just so that we can do planning for things like the Meet Echo and for catering and all that's kind of fun. And as I discussed earlier, we're kind of looking at June and September interims. We're expecting that one of those will be in North America and one will be in Europe, which I hope will not be controversial.
No, and I mean, if you have an interest in hosting one of these, or maybe 2018 if we keep doing them, come talk to us. You know, there's some things we like to see in interim sites in terms of room setup and connectivity and all of that. But we were very open to host it at your site.
Sure. Okay. So let's move on. As we said, we want to discuss the input drafts today. So let's just go through them, I think. Jonna, where'd Jonna get to? There you are. First up is Draft Hamilton Quick Transport Protocol, and Jonna has a presentation.
And while he sets up, can you raise your hand if you have an empty seat next to you? There's, again, people at the back. People at the back, go and find a hand and sit down. It's much more fun that way. Or stay standing.
1 second, I'll,
Thank you.
Nope, that's right. Tell me to forward.
Pink box.
Pink box, yeah.
Get used to it.
Morning, everybody. I'm basically going to just go through the core protocol spec as it's an individual submission at the moment, and it describes the core of the quick transport protocol. It describes various mechanisms, frame formats, Y formats, and such. Next slide.
Just a second, I'll get you a copy.
Okay.
If I can get
So I will not be going into the details of the draft at the moment. I'm assuming that you've either read the draft very carefully or you've at least skimmed through it to understand what it contains. It has a number of things in there, as is shown on the slide. It's got basically the broad overview of quick features, followed by things such as wire format for packet types, for frame types. It discusses what the various parts of a connection's lifetime are. It describes streams, flow control, and various other standard stuff. Next slide. That's basically all I'm going to talk about, the details of the draft itself. So if you have any questions about the draft and you've gone through it and you haven't felt like raising it on the mailing list but want to do it here, definitely do it after the talk. The current state of the draft specifically describes Quic version Q036. This is tethered to the current Google deployment. This is what we have deployed right now, and this is Google's version of Quic. This contains various things that are specific to Google's use of Quic as it is right now, which includes things such as a diversification nonce, because that's used by Quic's crypto, which is not TLS 1.3. The working group is chartered to work on defining a crypto interface, which by default will be TLS 1.3, but this is for our homegrown format. Other things such as timestamps are in our own beautiful little homegrown floating point format. Numbers are little endian. And if adopted, then the the expectation is that the draft will move away from the design that is currently present in the draft, or may move away from it in different parts. Next slide. So I'm going to reflect the discussions that have happened on the mailing list so far on this particular draft. The first is a small item about packet number versus sequence number, and I thought it was important to bring it up just because we made a very conscious decision to use packet number in Quic instead of sequence number, because packet number semantics in Quic are quite different from TCP's standard sequence number semantics. We discussed this a little bit in the loss recovery draft, but so we want to standardize on using make all the drafts uniform in using packet number. Next slide. Indianness was discussed on the mailing list. The current Quic version, which should be Q036, uses little endian numbers because we have basically been building for Chrome and for our Google deployment, and Chrome runs only on little endian machines, which is about everything but, I last count, about 21 machines left in the world which speak Big Endian. The idea, however, uses Big Endian for everything. So there's the obvious question of Quic is going to interact with everything else IETF, and everything else IETF happens to be Big Endian. So maybe there should be Big Endian. So that's a conversation that's happened on the list.
There's going to be a parking lot presentation, so we don't have to deal with this here.
Oh, yes, correct. I should make it clear. The point here is to simply reflect the conversations that have happened on the mailing list, not so much to come to a conclusion here. Or a decision on these points. Next slide. The other discussion that's happened has been about versioning. Quic uses a 32-bit version, and is currently the version is represented by basically using the ASCII values of 4 characters and dumping them in this 32-bit space. So Quic Q036 falls in this. It basically looks like this in 32 bits. Next. There was a Strawman proposal that Martin Thompson put up on the list, which seems reasonable. Next. And I proposed a modification to this, which allows for the current Google Quic versions to sort of reside in this experimental space. So this is the one thing I want to draw out here, is that in versioning, we have been talking about using some version numbers for sort of IETF standards work for drafts and for RFCs and so on, but also to leave open a bunch of versions for distributed experimentation by folks, not just Google, but by everybody else. And next, that means that we may want to have a wiki page for people who are deploying their own little modification of Quic, with the hope that it won't stay there for too long, with the hope that it'll come back into a draft in near future. Next. There are many other topics in the draft that are open for review and for discussion, and my expectation is that if adopted, we will discuss all of these. There's transport parameters format, which is currently there. We need to do a much more exhaustive listing of various transport parameters that we want to negotiate and do negotiate right now. There's some editorial work. Next. There are some medium order questions about the ACK timestamp format, which, as I pointed out earlier, uses a homegrown floating point Y format, and questions about connection ID, which will definitely get brought up here. Next. And finally, packet size, path MTU, and perhaps a need for a functional API, such as the one in 793. And that's about it. Any questions, thoughts, or are we doing this later?
Okay. Any questions, thoughts about this draft? And especially, I think we should focus on suitability for adoption.
Spencer Dawkins speaking at this point as a casual observer. Could you all ask how many people have read some version of this draft?
Show of hands. Almost a good proportion of the room, I would characterize that as.
So, and yeah, okay, thank you.
Okay, nobody's coming to the mic. In which case, I guess we'll do a hum. Whether the group wants to adopt this document as a starting point for our work item on the core protocol spec.
Keeping in mind the caveat about what a starting point means.
Right. So if you believe this document is suitable to be adopted at this time, please hum now.
And if you believe it should not be adopted, hum. Okay, strong
Right.
consensus.
That was very strong.
Okay, great. Thank you.
I'm sorry?
I think that was outside.
Ah, so there's people handing note. There's people humming in the Jabber as well.
Ah,
And good question.
Since there was such a strong consensus in favor, I was only going to say something if anybody held the opposite view. As far as I could tell, everybody hummed in favor.
okay.
So somebody in Jabber makes a statement for
It's not
everybody in
really
Jabber.
clear in Jabber because of the timing.
Craig T in Jabber says it's all 4. And then I hope he has the information to make that statement. But
So next up, we have the loss detection and congestion control document with Ian presenting.
Yes. Yeah, next slide. So it kind of describes the quick transmission machinery. In particular, it kind of focuses on the loss detection aspect of it. It does not go into the recovery aspect, which is the goal is to put that in the main document. It also goes into congestion control. There's a fair amount kind of missing right now, but the intent is to describe new Reno because, well, it's well understood, it's relatively simple, and it should kind of elucidate all the necessary mechanisms that Quic has. It also goes over the TCP mechanisms that are embodied in Quic. More of these will be fleshed out in terms of how kind of the TCP RFCs have implications on Quic design. But at least it kind of goes over what is embodied today, both in the implementation and the intent.
Yeah.
Next. As I said before, Quic loss detection separates recovery from detection. It's similar in spirit to TCP rack. It actually goes a little bit farther in terms of how it subsumes RTO and other things that haven't been moved into rack. But if you saw the TCPM presentation yesterday, that kind of gives you an idea of exactly how Quic loss detection works. And yes, all the packet numbering is also time ordering, so that makes loss detection much easier and quick. Next slide. Yeah, so in terms of work remaining to be done, there's a fair number of constants that are mostly pulled out of the Linux kernel and other defaults. Those need to probably have rationales and or negotiation added for them. There are aspects of RTT measurement. These are things like smooth RTT and min RTT and stuff that are fairly common in the TCP world, but need proper definitions in the Quic world, as well as bytes in flight, things like this. And yes, a full description of new Reno. So, that's it. Questions?
This is Martin Duke. On the congestion control section, my impression of Quic is that there's a lot more variability in the size of the control information relative to user payload. And it would be nice to clarify, I mean, if you're going to use TCP congestion control, which is of course byte-based, it'd be nice to clarify what bytes count, you know, what the meaning of an MSS is in terms of Quic, and so on.
Okay. Yeah, no, I agree that deserves definition. I mean, sort of like the bytes in flight question is, it's much more like a TCP pipe than it is like a traditional TCP in-flight measurement.
Yeah, and then as a second comment on the loss recovery, I noticed in the latest draft you have a very nice pseudocode treatment of how to do loss detection. Then there's a lot of references to TCP RFCs, which I think maybe to someone reading this for the first time confuses the issue because some of those mechanisms are well reflected, some are not. Yeah. I'm fine with having informational kind of background saying, you know, here's some things that inform this design, but I would really, there not to be any musts or shoulds in that TCP section. Just use the logic that you have there.
Okay, that's a good recommendation, and use those basically as references for the reader, for example.
So, Martin, would it be correct to say that the intent is that all TCP references would be informative, and this document should normatively describe the algorithm in a standalone fashion?
I would say that's generally the case, unless there's a mechanism similar to what we're doing with TLS, where we're essentially just importing a thing
Right.
as an atomic unit. But I don't think that's true for TCP, at least at this point.
Thank you.
So
Thanks.
Marcelo Añuelo, I mean, more or less in the same spirit that what he's saying. I mean, is the plan just to leave just as a placeholders, like referencing other specs with like a tiny paragraph, or the plan is to expand on this and this is just a first step?
I think the intent is to be complete in and of itself and provide references kind of from where the foundation of that
So-
came from.
Basically, what you're saying is that in its current form, basically what you have there is just placeholders for what the real section will be.
Yeah, in some cases, yeah. In particular, congestion control is just a.
Well,
a
it's
place-
not only congestion control, right? I mean, it's all.
Yeah,
over the place, right?
the loss detection section minus a few errors that were pointed out on the list is getting fairly close to complete. I mean, if you look at the Quic code, it's not a particularly large amount of code, but I think it's probably insufficiently verbose in terms of describing. Right? But the pseudocode is not too far off what we actually
Okay,
have.
thanks.
Janayang, I'll add that it's going to be hard to have any normative references to TCP mechanisms in general because none of those drafts actually specify the mechanism separate from the wire format. So it's not just, I don't expect it to be possible to have normative reference to TCP. We can have informative ones, and that's what we have in there right now. So for intuition, for people to understand what exactly these mechanisms are doing, that's what the references are there for.
Fair point. And we don't want to need Quic implementers to read like 17 million outdated TCP RFCs.
Yeah,
that
most of which spend their time actually explaining how to like deal with retransmission ambiguity.
Right. I'd like to third that. Like, it'd be really nice if this document was essentially self-contained. I'd like to understand the intellectual heritage, perhaps, but like, it's not requiring me to read those documents.
All right.
And just in defense of the document as it is right now, the goal was to basically get out the core algorithm out there for folks who understand loss recovery to actually look at it and see if it gels. But yeah, it definitely needs editorial work.
Yeah, so I mean, at the moment, right, TCP people can look at this and connect the dots in their head, while app implementers can't, and we need to get it to the point where app implementers can't.
Absolutely.
But the starting point doesn't need to be there yet.
Yeah, and this is important to get done.
Right. Any further thoughts or concerns about adopting this as a starting point for that deliverable?
Well, just as another comment, sorry, this is Martin Duke again. On the new Reno congestion control, I assume you're planning to have a pluggable congestion control, as in?
Yeah, I think the idea is that there will be an API kind of in the document or between kind of how Quic works and the congestion controller, and we'll define one as an example. And New Reno is just chosen for simplicity.
Yeah.
Something like Quic is extremely complex relatively.
The charter actually talks about the standard congestion controller, I think, or did we actually name New Reno? Because Quic will be a standard soon.
Oh, okay.
And then
Well,
it might be an option.
So I think that the general idea was to basically have one default congestion controller specified, but at the same time open, and that is also going to be not required to be implemented by folks.
This is Martin Duke again. At the risk of opening a bit of a can of worms, it would be nice if there was some standards for what additional congestion controls need to meet. I mean, we don't really have that in TCP, as far as I'm concerned, beyond sort of a general notion of fairness to existing flows.
Right.
And my only concern about starting with New Reno, I think there's advantages in terms of Quic being fair to TCP, but perhaps that constrains us in certain ways regarding the state of the art in congestion control.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I don't think New Reno is supposed to be the best choice by any means. I really think. I mean, we can definitely adopt something different. The main reason was purely for simplicity, and the number of lines you need to implement New Reno is vastly fewer than like every other congestion control.
The charter says that the work will describe use of a standard congestion controller, which at the moment means New Reno, but Quic will be available very soon. To Martin's other point, right? We don't even have a sort of described